Commonwealth Office, which would have been a very interesting job. So his perspectives on Europe and the European Union, I know, will be of interest to you. He comes from Scotland, from Renfrewshire, where my ancestors came from before they migrated to Australia. At least the Scottish component of my ancestry came from there. And Loch Winnock they came from. Jim grew up partly in South Africa, so that gives him quite a Commonwealth perspective. And I know I first came to know him when he was the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development. Was it Defence or International Development? I think actually I came to know you when you were the Shadow Secretary of State for International Development, so for the aid programme. So I'm sure you'll all very much enjoy hearing from him tonight. He's not only going to give you a talk, but as is the tradition, I'll ask him a few questions and engage in a discussion with him, and then we'll throw it open to the floor and you can ask him whatever you like. Just to say that all of these meetings are designed to be frank, they're designed to be educational, and therefore they have to be under Chatham House rules. It doesn't help if our guest speakers are then quoted in the media and there's all sorts of media storm coming out of what they've said. So we'd like Jim to be very frank and fulsome. Even if he has to criticise the Labour Party, we'll try not to tell the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or the Daily Telegraph. We'll do our best. We'll do our best. But in any case, you'll find him very entertaining. So, ladies and gentlemen, Jim Murphy.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for that lovely warm welcome. I'd like to say it's great to be at ROSL, but I'm so regularly here as a member. So if you take nothing else from being here this evening, if you're not already a member, please do think about becoming one. Is that okay? I can sit down now, Alexander. Is that okay? And it's great to see my old colleague Gisela Stewart in the front row. I'm also a former Labour Member of Parliament for Edgbaston in the Midlands, and now is doing some other great things, sometimes with the Labour Party and sometimes less with the Labour Party. Alexander asked me to answer 3 questions this evening, and I'm going to try and answer, I'm going to attempt and answer all 3, 2 of which I knew beforehand, and the third he told me just as I arrived. So the first question is, will Scotland become independent? Nice easy one. The second one is, what to expect from a Labour government? Another straightforward one. And then the third was, why are politicians held in relative terms with such disdain? And obviously I'd be tempted, it's because Gisela and I are no longer in Parliament, but that would be a superficial and inaccurate answer. So the first one is, will Scotland become independent? But I'll declare an interest, as I have in all 3 of the questions. I certainly hope not. But could Scotland be independent? Of course it could. And that's an important point to make. Scotland could be independent. So the question is, should it be independent? And my argument, and at the moment still the majority argument in Scotland, is that it shouldn't become independent. But the question that Alexander's asked me to answer is a different one. Will it become independent? And I think it boils down to one thing, which is, do you believe that the age of populism is coming to an end? Do you believe that facts matter? Do you believe that reasoned argument should win the day? Because depending on where you sit on the answers to those questions, that gets you closer to a viewpoint on whether Scotland will become independent at some point. Now, I know that during the Brexit referendum, Michael Gove, who is now beatified, of course, sorry, Father, I miss using your parlance there, but we now beatify Michael Gove. I mean, infamously said we've had enough of experts. So again, if you've had enough of experts, then it's more likely Scotland will become independent. If you think populism is going to be entrenched further, it's more likely Scotland will become independent. If facts matter, again, Father, excuse me, if facts matter less than the politics of religiosity, which is, I just believe it, therefore it should happen, then Scotland's more likely to be independent. Because objectively, the arguments against independence, I would suggest, are weaker now than they were in 2014 when we had the referendum. Because back then in 2014, we were being told it's Scotland's oil, and oil at $113 a barrel will pay the bills. Now, we now know that oil fluctuates. We knew that anyway. We know that there's a carbon transition going on. We know that the Scottish Government doesn't really want to take much more of the oil out of the North Sea in any case. So the argument around the economics has become weaker, but the other side of the argument would say the politics has become stronger. Because look what's happened in the past 8 years. We have had not one, but 4 Conservative Prime Ministers. And you can all come to your own view as to whether each of them was an upgrade in their predecessor or otherwise. We've had Brexit that both Scotland and Northern Ireland voted against. We've had austerity. Again, I would argue that Scotland, Wales and large parts of the north of England and England cities, broadly speaking, voted against. And we've had the events over the past couple of weeks, which haven't been government in its perfect mode. And yet, even now, despite all of that's happened over the last 8 years, the independence cause hasn't yet managed to gather a majority support in Scotland. And this is an important week for the argument. Again, if you may not have followed this, but the Scottish Government has got a court case at the UK Supreme Court as to whether the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament can decide it's time for another referendum. Now, there'll be perhaps some lawyers in the room, but the devolution settlement, when it was introduced in the early years of Tony Blair's government, made it clear that the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly as was, and the Northern Ireland Assembly, have power over the things that are devolved to it. And unless it is explicitly devolved, power is retained in the UK government and the UK Parliament. And the power over the Constitution of the United Kingdom is not devolved and therefore is retained. And therefore, the question remains, when would Scotland have a referendum? And both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party have made clear there won't be a second referendum sanctioned by a UK government. So all of that leads to all sorts of other questions, because ultimately it's a union based upon consent. So perhaps we can have a conversation about that. So my answer to the question would be, will Scotland become independent? I don't believe it will in my lifetime. Could Scotland become independent? Of course it could. Any country could become independent. Wales could become independent. Northern Ireland arguably could become independent, or it could reunify with the South. And I happen to believe there is more likelihood in my lifetime of us seeing a united Ireland than seeing a divided Britain. But, you know, it's hard to predict politics in a week, let alone a lifetime. But that would be my sense of it. A united Ireland before a divided Britain. So the second thing, Alexander, you asked me to talk about was the Labour Party. Look, the Labour Party, to which I still belong, has tested the affections of its supporters in the last at least 7 years. We picked the wrong brother, and then we picked someone who at least enabled or encouraged hatred of Jews. I mean, it's not a great prospectus for the one of the two big democratic parties in the United Kingdom. And Jeremy Corbyn was completely ill-suited, emotionally, intellectually, in any sense to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. I think in a parliament of 650 people, you need an eclectic mix. And I think he about passes muster to be one of the 650, but not to be the first among equals as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But Labour has jettisoned, I mean, he's now suspended from the Labour Party. The Labour Party has in itself decided that it's willing to win. It's lost 4 elections in a row. In the period of universal franchise, it's very unusual for the Labour Party to lose 5 in a row. And as any of you who follow politics will know, there hasn't been a Labour leader since the 1970s who has won an election who hasn't had the surname Blair. And that's not a great record. So I happen to think that Keir Starmer is willing to win. I think that I was at the Labour Party conference the week before last, and I arrived at the Labour Party conference thinking Labour was trying to get into power by virtue of allowing the Conservatives to lose power. And that's arguably in a democracy, that's enough. Allow the government to lose. But I left the conference a little more heartened, which is that Labour is also trying to win the upcoming election, as well as force the Conservatives to lose it. And so to have both of those currents running alongside one another can be powerful. So what to expect? Well, we can talk about this for hours, but I'll just say the 3 things I would expect from a Labour government. 1 would be security. 2 would be, in terms of what they're trying to achieve, 1 would be security, the second thing would be prosperity, and the third would be decency. And I'll just say a word or 2 about each of those 3, if that's okay. In terms of security, what I mean by that is a sense that the first duty of any government is to keep its people safe. I mean, I'm not into American exceptionalism, but I quite like the phrase of protecting your nation from enemies domestic and foreign. So that's about domestic safety and international, and safety on the international stage. So that's about the combination of hard power and an attachment to NATO that is unequivocal. Not everyone will love this sentence, but a commitment to the continuation of the independent nuclear deterrent, which I think is important, as well as the soft power. The soft power of international development, the soft power of the BBC World Service, the soft power, it may sound trivial, but the British Council, which is a really important organisation. So that whole suite of soft power is very important. And growing up in South Africa, under apartheid, I didn't get any news about what was happening in South Africa except through the BBC World Service. It was the only source of reliable news. When I was in the Negev desert with Bedouin tribesmen, where did they get their news? They got the news from the BBC World Service and one of the language services on a wind-up radio. I imagine these things are now solar-powered. But that remarkable reach of some of the soft power influences, whether it's English football, whether it's the royal family, whether it's the BBC and the many other soft power influences that the UK has. So security in its broadest sense. Prosperity, look, we can have a conversation, I'm sure, about this, but prosperity, a sense that higher wages in return for higher productivity, with a sense of green credentials and the climate transition being centrepiece of it, by ensuring that making Brexit work, we can debate what that entails, but it surely must entail better or closer working relationships with some of our nearest neighbours. We're looking at the National Health Service as an issue of prosperity. Like, 500,000 people have left the workforce in the last 3 years. Half of that number is because of long-term illness. So if we are going to have fewer immigrants, which the country seems to have arrived at that policy, debate whether it's a good or bad policy, but we seem to have arrived at that policy. We surely can't tolerate 250,000 of our own citizens not being able to be in the workforce because of long-term illness. So National Health Service is an economic productivity and an economic competitive argument, as well as a human fulfilment and a social justice argument. And there's so many other issues that the Labour Party will want to address in a holistic sense of what is prosperity. And then the third of security, prosperity and decency. This might sound like the most amorphous of the three, but one of the reasons why I was really, really, really rubbish at opposition is perhaps because I got quite an affection for the institutions of the United Kingdom, whether that's the monarchy, whether it's the armed forces, whether it's church, faith organisations or others. And one of the things I've enjoyed least about recent times, and I think so far in my comments I've tried not to be, I've been reflecting rather than in any way being partisan, but I think the way in which some very senior people in the United Kingdom over recent years have deliberately denigrated important institutions in a country with an unwritten constitution has been at times dangerous. I think you sign international agreements, you stick to them. I think you value the independence of the civil service, whether they're giving you the advice that you wanted or the advice that they are there to offer you. I think that we protect the independence of the BBC. Of course, it can continue to change, but we shouldn't hold threats of funding over an organisation simply because you didn't like what they broadcast or what they said. Now, that's perhaps a pretty opinionated point of view, but it's an opinion that I hold dear and I would protect. And so what may we get from a Labour government? I think a return to, I'm not saying there's not going to be anger, I'm not saying there's not going to be frustration, I'm not saying there's not going to be elements on the outer edges of the left of the Labour Party that aren't going to be persistently angry on social media and elsewhere. But at the leadership level in the Labour Party, from Keir Starmer and others, I think a respect for decency, a value of difference, a tolerance of intellectual diversity. And so I would expect to see a further enshrinement of the independence of the civil service. I would want to see them make some moves towards a written Bill of Rights. I'd like to see further entrenched so that a government couldn't overrule Parliament and that neither Parliament nor government could overrule an international obligation. So while not here this evening to announce the Labour Party's manifesto, I think thematically those are the three areas that they'll focus on. And then the last question is, why is there less affection for our politicians? Now, was it Harold Wilson? I think it was Harold Wilson, Gisela, you'll correct me, but I think it was Harold Wilson said that politicians complaining about the media and perception are like a sailor complaining about the sea. There's absolutely no point, because one without the other can't occur. But what's happened? Look, this is a global phenomenon. It's not the UK, no matter where. I should have said, I'm no longer involved in politics. I'm actively involved in party politics. I give the Labour Party a chunk of money, but I only give them one vote. But I now run a consultancy. We run elections internationally for candidates that I would vote for. So if you wanted to be the president, any of you, somewhere warm, we would help run your campaign. And some places that are cold. But never for anyone aligned to Moscow or Beijing. They have to be Democrats. The second thing we do is we support governments in their geopolitics and their international outreach. And the third thing we do is we advise corporate clients on navigating UK politics. It's great fun. It's my own business. It's my own consultancy. And I do things that I enjoy. But why do we have a less respect for our politicians? Well, first of all, I'll only offer two, and then we can have a wider conversation. It's the demise of deference, universally. No matter what role you were in, whether it's in faith, whether it's in the voluntary sector, whether it's in government, whether it's a doctor, a police officer. I know that if I had gone home and told my mother that I was in trouble with either a priest or a local police officer, I would have been in more trouble. So there's a demise of deference, and some of that's fine, because I think respect's got to be earned rather than just conveyed. But there's also the sort of phenomenon post-2007 and the rise of social media platforms, where everyone knows at least as much as the professional politician does on every and all chosen subjects. It used to be the case when I was in Parliament that the only people I didn't tell what I did were taxi drivers in London, because London taxi drivers know everything about every subject, and someone I was sitting next to on a long-haul flight, because I know that I would spend 14 or 15 hours having my earbud. And that did once happen to me when I was flying back from Tokyo. As I went to sit down, this person looked very accommodating with their body language and made space for me to sit in the middle of the aisle. And the person said, "Mr. Murphy, I'm a constituent and I've been meaning to write to you about my bins." I've been meaning to write to you about my bins. Now, see if it had been, I was meaning to write to you about geopolitics or something, that might have been more entertaining for me, but it wasn't, and it isn't. However, social media has allowed people the perception that they know at least as much as you do. And in many cases that may be the case. In some cases that may be the truth. But when people live inside a social media bubble, or their own protected environment, where the only people they interact with online are people who violently agree with them, all of that becomes reinforcing. So towards the end of my time in politics, in case this may have been the same for you, towards the end of my time in politics, when I started in politics, information on a doorstep when you were canvassing was largely one way, which was, this is what we'll do if you elect my party. By the end of my time in politics, it was a two-way process, but mostly coming towards me, because people had just found their truth online. And part of that truth is that all politicians were stealing their expenses, all politicians were in it for themselves, and all government lets you down in the end. None of that's true. And that to me is the danger. That to me is the danger between you're all the same, the denigration of politics, the dissipation of democratic participation will weaken our nation further. I'll finish with this anecdote, is that, and I don't enjoy it, but when I started in politics, if someone was a non-voter, you would knock on their door and they say, "I'm sorry, Jim," or "Sorry, Mr. Murphy," depending on the age. "I'm sorry," well, it'd be Jim because most older people did vote. So, "I'm sorry, I don't vote. I don't get involved. I don't know enough about it." That's fine. I don't like that, but it's fine. That's a democracy. Towards the end of my time in politics, the person would open the door and would verbally, with huge amounts of energy, explain to me why they're not voting. And it was almost a militant apathy. And I think that is fundamentally, for our democracy, fundamentally unhealthy. Let me list the 25 reasons why I don't vote, and none of them are the one reason that people would have given 20 years earlier, which is I don't know enough about it. It's because I know so much about it, I don't vote. And I think somewhere in that cocktail of issues is the answer to the third question, Alexander, about why do people not have a great affection for politics and politicians. So I hope, to some extent, that's helped address all three of the questions. And I'll happily, whether militantly or otherwise, be interrogated by you. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Jim, very much. That was really, really excellent and very entertaining as well. I appreciate it. Well, so first of all, let's go back and have a look again at this issue of the Scottish independence movement. My perception as a foreigner, as an outsider, but with Scottish ancestors as well as English ancestors, my perception is that no amount of rational analysis is going to change people's minds. This is an emotional issue. And I felt this a little bit with Brexit as well, that, I mean, in the end, there was Project Fear, but people just wanted out, and they were prepared, even if Project Fear turned out to be right, which I don't think it did, they weren't going to be too influenced by that. And my sense with Scotland, when I first came here, which was in May 2014, so it was about 6 months before the referendum, the polls showed that the Union would win easily. And then as time went on, the lead just kept diminishing till it became sort of at one stage, the polls showed it was frighteningly close. But it seemed to be driven by emotion. And how do you capture the emotion of the Union to counter the emotion of Scottish independence?
Look, it's a big question that my side of the argument hasn't fully got the answer to. But when 85% of those people who vote in Scotland don't vote Conservative, so 85% of those who vote don't vote for the party that's in charge, and hasn't done since the 1950s, it does make it a harder argument. It doesn't make it an impossible argument, but it makes it a harder argument. Because, like I'm saying this in private, vote to stay in the UK to be governed by a party you have absolutely no intentions of ever voting for. It isn't exactly Braveheart. So those of us who think that a different way of governing the United Kingdom is possible have to be back on the pitch if there was another referendum, which is, it's not an argument. So those people who fundamentally believe in the Union, let's just for argument's sake, this isn't statistically true, but just for argument's sake, a third of Scotland will vote for independence regardless. And a third will vote to stay in the UK regardless. But it's a generalisation. There are many people on my side of the argument who say you're insufficiently unionist in your appeal. But that's you only talking to the 1/3 who are already committed to be part of the United Kingdom. I hope you don't mind me saying this, but if I thought independence was good for Scotland, I would campaign for it. Because my sense of being in favour of this union is because it has utility. It has utility for all of us on this island, certainly the Great British Island. So the people who are already committed to the Union, they can't be even more committed to the Union, and this will be decided in the middle. And these are people who want something completely different. It's a mixed bag of people, but they are people who are impatient for change. And the remarkable success of the last 8 years is that despite having these 4 Conservative Prime Ministers, we've managed to maintain a majority support. Now, what will it look like if we have another referendum? I think we'll learn the lessons from the 2014 and the Brexit referendum, and we will have to have a good deal more passion in our argument. But the difficulty will be to how to escape from under the assertion that facts are fear. Because Project Fear, you can equally argue, is Project Fact. And that's a challenge for us, because facts, I come back to this, facts and truth should matter. And at the moment, they appear to matter less than they should.
If there was a Labour government in the UK as a whole, would that make the job of the SNP more difficult?
It would. Yes, it would. And it's already showing itself to be more difficult. Keir Starmer, and I get Keir Starmer, Keir Starmer's not going to make you want to spontaneously rise to your feet and cheer until you lose your voice. That's not the type of leader he is. He's not a Punch and Judy sort of end of the pier entertainer. He's a thoroughly decent, substantial, thoughtful man. He's more popular in Scotland at the moment than Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister. For the first time. That's the first time since Gordon Brown was Prime Minister that that's been true, that the leader of the Labour Party is more popular than the leader of the SNP. The first time since Gordon. That's significant. Ed Miliband never did that. Jeremy Corbyn, of course, didn't until recently. Keir didn't. And if the next UK general election is, who do you want to run the United Kingdom? It's a close two-horse, and these polls will narrow, of course. And this is the Conservatives are at the bottom end of their performance level in the opinion polls, I think. But if it's a competitive race between the two big parties, Conservative and Labour, there'll be sufficient number of Scottish voters who say, I'm going to give the Labour Party my vote back. And Labour's already at 30%, the SNP are at 45%, but Labour's back to 30% in Scotland, its highest rating in 7 years. So Labour has to take some vote. Labour's now taking the easy votes, which is the votes from the Conservatives in Scotland, because Labour is now the leading pro-union party in Scotland again. What it needs to do now is take 5 or 6% directly from the SNP. That's harder. And you don't take those votes from the SNP by wrapping yourself in the union flag. You take those votes from the SNP being more economically radical than the SNP and having a very potent change message. And even if those people don't love you, if they're willing to temporarily lend you their vote, and if there are 5 or 6% of them, then Labour is very competitive in Scotland and can win a UK majority.
Let's just think about, that's very interesting, let's just think about a Labour government and the issues that the country is facing today. So first of all, you indicate in your speech that foreign policy essentially wouldn't change and security policy wouldn't change, or you say,
yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure what this means, but that you would get on better with the Europeans. Well, I don't know about that. You'd have to deal with all the same issues. The Northern Ireland Protocol might be resolved by then, but might not be as well. And you might not find that any easier than the Tories find it to resolve. But it's domestic policy that would be, I suppose, a bit different. The Conservatives would, what they privately say is that Labour will do what the Australian Labour Party has done and say, well, we'll run pretty much the same economic policy, might not quite say that now, economic policy as the present government, but they would run social issues very differently. They would be much more into their sort of identity politics and critical theory, critical race theory. Race comes out of the Labour Party quite strongly as a theme,
of course.
And Conservatives would say setting races against each other in a country which is supposed to be multicultural. So I mention all of this because Conservatives often talk about this. I've just been at the Conservative Party conference. Is this true? Or does the Labour Party need to manage this issue so it doesn't create the perception of being a woke party?
Yeah, I think the Conservatives at the next election will want it to be you can't trust Labour with the economy. I think they'll want it to be, you can't trust Labour with Brexit. And they'll want it to be about identity and wedge issues around values about, one of the things about not being in politics is I'm not involved in these conversations, okay? But the debate about transgender rights and all those things, that's what the Conservative Party want. That's where the Conservative Party want to be. I think the next election is going to be about some much bigger issues. I think if you look at where we're going to be economically, we'll probably still have high interest rates. We will have re-imported inflation for the second time in 2 or 3 years by virtue of a weaker currency, possibly. The war in Ukraine will still be going on, and we will be on the cusp in the government's public spending plans of a level of austerity that anyone actually, it's very hard to remember, except for a period in the early 80s, it'll be hard to recall a period of austerity quite as tough, because the government spending plans envisage substantial cuts from, I think, 26 and 27. So, very tough financial position. But I think the election will be about much bigger things than what the Conservatives want it to be about.
So what you're saying is you don't think the public will be too concerned about those, but why don't we just call them identity issues?
Yeah, I think the public will be interested in them. I think the public will be fascinated by them, but to the point that it doesn't affect. It affects it affects such a small number of people in relative terms. I think the public will be it'll be the economy, as someone has said before. The economy and Britain's place in the world. I think that's where it will be at the next election.
Yeah. Now, just thinking about politicians and why they have become decreasingly popular certainly in my life.
Increasingly unpopular. You say decreasingly popular, I say increasingly unpopular.
In my lifetime, it's more the public have become increasingly cynical and disbelieving of politicians. And in continental Europe and the UK and the US, here's an argument. The electoral system is such, the first past the post system, that in the end, minor parties are never going to get, or not likely to get, much traction. But in the European Union, some major parties, which are historic, have either disappeared or come close to disappearing. I mean, in Italy, we just had a recent election, and Giorgia Meloni has come out on top with her Brothers of Italy party. For much of my life, the Christian Democrats dominated Italian politics. They don't even exist anymore, to the best of my knowledge. In Germany, the CDU, CSU have been, or not so much the CSU, but the CDU has been substantially on the slide. The Chancellor may be from the SDP, but, or was it SPD? SPD. The Chancellor may be from the SPD, but their vote was pretty low, and they're polling extremely poorly now. So much as what was once a major party is becoming much more marginal. In France, the Republican Party barely exists, and the Socialist Party doesn't really exist. So there has been a huge change, and this presumably is a response, a public response, to dissatisfaction with the status quo politicians. That seems to me why someone like Giorgia Meloni would sort of burst through, and it hasn't quite happened yet, but is going to become the Prime Minister of Italy. So I'm thinking about what are the variables that could have led this to happen. First of all, we haven't seen economic collapse. We have the war in Ukraine, but we haven't seen developed countries engaged heavily in war. We haven't seen plunging living standards, nothing like that. So secondly, we've seen an increase in the level of education of the average politician over the last 30 or 40 years, there's no doubt about that. We've seen a substantial increase in the number of women in politics. Are we putting this down to all the women in politics? No one would dare say that. So what is, and I suppose the other variable is the public has become much better educated. So what's your sort of explanation for this huge transformation that is happening, and what's more, where is it leading?
I think that we live in an age, rather than going to each individual political party, I think we live in an age of acceleration where this pace of transformation is such that it discombobulates people and they grasp for certainties or they grasp for easy answers to complicated questions. We live in a world where technology comes and goes, and a technology goes from being a concept to being outmoded. I think the rhythm is about 7 years, and yet government takes 15 years to catch up with trying to regulate that technology. We live in a world where the population, again, Father, I'm not picking on you, but I think it was Thomas Friedman that said that not since the age of Adam and Eve, when they gave birth to Cain and Abel, has a generation been able to say that the population has doubled in their lifetime. And yet, in the 9 decades from the 1960s onwards, the population of the world is going to treble. So we just live in a period of remarkable transformative change, that understandably none of us voted for, because these are movements and things that are outside the power of the ballot box or the actions of one government. And all of that has created pulses and urges across politics in multiple countries that the majority of Republicans in the US believe that President Trump had the election stolen from him, even now. The majority. And we're heading into a new election cycle where the majority of voters for one of the two parties believes that. We live in a world where only 3 years ago, the Labour Party was run by someone who made the Jewish community and many others feel deeply uncomfortable. All of this gets me to... one of the things I do when I interview people for a new job, and it's one of the lovely things about running your own business, is you get to interview lots of interesting folk. And I ask them, and it's only for the senior jobs do I ask this, because it's a really hard answer. I say to them, what's the one thing, tell me, that you've changed your mind about recently? Because I don't think changing your mind's a bad thing. Actually, hearing someone else's argument and thinking, actually, I see the world from a different point of view. I see that as a fundamental strength. Now, when I was in politics, I probably didn't appreciate that enough. So one example of that, and I've changed my view about how we elect our politicians. I've always believed in coalition governments in the UK. I just happen to believe that the Labour Party was a coalition and the Conservative Party was a coalition. The Corbyn thing proved that the Labour Party isn't guaranteed to always be a coalition. It can be run by an ill-informed Marxist. And I happen to believe that the last two British Conservative Prime Ministers and leaders prove that the Conservative Party is no longer a coalition, or it's not the broad coalition I would want that I think our country is safe in the hands of. And therefore I would rather an electoral system that forces the parties into something that I think over the last century both naturally were, which were instinctively coalitions of disparate groups. Broadly speaking, a centre-left coalition, and broadly speaking, a centre-right coalition. Neither party, both parties have proven that there's no guarantee that they are such a thing, and therefore I've changed my view on how we elect our politicians. Even if it punishes the party that I vote for, so be it. One of the things I don't enjoy is that Change UK party that came out of dissatisfaction with both Corbyn Labour and, was it Theresa May Conservatives at the time? I think it was. The sort of hard pro-Brexit and the hard anti-free market Labour position. That was launched and then collapsed. I think there were some really talented people in that party that deserved to do much better than they did, and our electoral system fails. Now, I don't want to reward failure. I don't want to reward people who have only got 1% support. But I'm not sure we can trust our two main parties to always be the coalition that our country needs.
Right, well there's quite a thought. Let me throw it open. We've got 10 more minutes, so let me throw it open to the floor. If you have any questions, we'll start with you.
I'm really interested in your view on why the Labour Party hasn't reopened the possibility of rejoining the EU. I know there's a fear potentially of losing the northern seats, but it could undermine the SNP, for example, quite significantly. And secondly, from having seen Keir Starmer at the conference, do you think he's got enough strong people around him to fill some of the gaps and the areas he hasn't got, such as charisma? Because it's the one thing that Jeremy Corbyn did do was win the hearts and minds of that very young population. That the most vociferous conversations I had with 20 and 30-year-olds was they loved him.
Absolutely.
They thought he was the saviour. So what can we take from that to win that age group back to proper politics and not just charisma?
Yeah. Okay, do you want me to answer a couple?
Yeah, just do one. I prefer one at a time.
Okay, I'll give you a short.
Because I think the audience lose focus on the question if you bunch them all together.
No problem. So you are right about the excitement that the Corbyn project created. I remember picking up my daughter from a nightclub in Glasgow on the night of the 2017 election. I couldn't go out and campaign for them. I didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister, so I couldn't lie to people. And I don't drink, so I'm a very popular father. So I went and picked up my daughter, and the club was emptying at 3 o'clock, and at 3 o'clock no one had left. And so my daughter came, I texted her, and the daughter's, she was 21 at the time. I said, where have you, she came out 40 minutes later than the nightclub closed. I said, where have you been? He said, oh, we were having a sing-song. I said, what about? She said, Jeremy Corbyn. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you're all drunk, and what are you singing about? Jeremy Corbyn. So, and that was the vast majority of people that were still in the nightclub. So there was a sense of excitement. I think there are other people in the Labour Party who have that charisma. Angela Rayner, the deputy leader, could to some extent be the sort of John Prescott to Tony Blair. Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, who at some point may go back to Parliament, has that charisma. So there are others, there definitely are. But one of the things that, I'm a big football fan, okay? And one of the things in a city where there are two football clubs is you sometimes play a game of who from the other team would you like in your team? So the people do it in Liverpool, they do it in Manchester, they do it in Glasgow. I look at the current government, the cabinet, and I honestly say sometimes to myself, because as I wind away the moments on a flight or something, I say to myself, who from the current cabinet would I want in the shadow cabinet? And there aren't that many. I mean, I'm genuinely not trying to make a partisan point. It's simply because Liz Truss has deliberately chosen to pick her senior team from such a narrow and shallow talent pool that I think Labour are in a much stronger position. The last thing about rejoining the EU, I think that's a project for my daughter's generation. I don't think you're going to have the Labour Party at this or subsequent elections saying that we're going to rejoin the EU. I think you might say, well, we'll have a national interest test on more constructive engagement with them, but I don't think rejoining the EU is anything this side of 20 or 30 years away.
And in that period, I suppose the EU will change.
Of course.
Will have changed beyond recognition.
I think so.
I don't know how it will have changed, but it will change. Right, next question.
I think it'll have more members if the French allow it.
It could have more members, yeah. Yeah, well, that's a debate for another time.
Yeah.
I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what Labour should and could do with regards to its relationship with the trade unions and the important role they play in funding and governance, but also its relationship with business and to win even more support from within the city.
Well, I think that one of the people I didn't mention was Rachel Reeves, who's the Shadow Chancellor. And again, if you're playing fantasy politics, would you swap Rachel for our current Chancellor? I think that when you look at the Labour Party, and I'm not here to make an argument for it, I'm not trying to convince you, I'm giving a positive, sort of pro-Labour, positive about Labour perspective. I'm not trying to convince you to vote for one thing or the other. But they've got ground to make up in their engagement with business, they know that. Because the Corbyn thing rightly destroyed those connections. So they are working very hard with the city. But the city also, I think, will have to appreciate, as will other aspects of industry, that things are going to change. So the fact that Keir's not charismatic doesn't mean he won't be radical. So there are going to have to be changes. So those people who, for example, invest in the water industry, that's an industry that Labour won't be nationalised, but I think you will see a much more significant regulation of that industry, which for the city investors who are used to very regular returns and investment out of that industry, that may worry them a little. So the short answer to your precise question is two things. Labour will be more engaged with business, so they'll give much more time. And in terms of the unions, Keir Starmer now has greater control of the Labour Party structures than Tony Blair did. Now, the perception of Tony Blair had been a control freak of the Labour Party. Keir has more entrenched power. I was wrong about this. I thought Keir Starmer would take a much longer period to embed his influence in the Labour Party. He's done it in 3 years, what I thought would take him 7 or 8. And the trade unions themselves, please don't see the trade unions through the prism of the leadership of Unite the Union. Unite the Union may be the second largest union, previously run by a gentleman, and that's used in the broadest sense, a gentleman called Len McCluskey. The other unions, he's no longer there now, but the leadership of 4 of the 5 of the big unions are eminently sensible people. Sure, they're going to disagree with the Labour Party, surely they're going to disagree with the CBI, but they are patriots who want the best for their members. And I think, please don't see trade unionism through the prism of 1970s industrial action, or the bogeyman of the caricature of the Daily Telegraph. There are people, serious people who lead most of these unions now, and who have got something sensible to say.
Okay, we've got time for another question. One more.
Thanks very much for your very interesting talk. You mentioned that the SNP has about 45% popularity. It's been in government, as far as I'm aware, in Scotland since 2007. Conservatives have been in power since 2010, and their popularity has been dropping. To what do you attribute the fantastic longevity of the popularity of the SNP, given, frankly, as an outsider, fairly undistinguished governing record?
I think that's, if I'd love you to have the answer for that, because I think Labour, Lib Dems and the Conservatives in Scotland, it makes them scratch their head, but I think there's quite a straightforward response to it, is that in the referendum in 2014, 45% of people voted to leave the UK, 55% voted to remain. The 55%, when it comes to an election, are divided between three major parties. And the 45%, largely the SNP have it to themselves. So when it comes to the distribution of seats, in a four-party system, if your floor is 45%, you're guaranteed to win the majority of the seats. The question then is, why do they remain there? I would encourage people to just look at Dundee and to realise the extent to which the politics of identity and the politics of the schism of the two tribes between Leave and Remain in the UK. Dundee, it's a lovely city. It's gone through a rejuvenation. Visit it if you can. The V&A is there now. But it has the highest drug deaths in Europe. Right? So Scotland has the highest drug deaths in Europe of any country. Dundee has the highest drug deaths in Scotland. The Minister for Drugs Policy is a member of the Scottish Parliament, or was, from Dundee. He had to resign. So here is the Minister for the governing party who represents the city with the highest drug deaths, in the city with the highest drug deaths, in the country with the highest drug deaths. And he resigned within a few short months of the election. What happened to him in the subsequent election? He increased his majority in the city with the highest drug deaths, in the country with the highest drug deaths, for a policy that he was responsible for. Because independence is more important for a sufficient number of people. Now, I'm not going to draw direct parallels because politics is more complicated than this. The Brexit thing in parts of England, where Labour had always won, why fast forward 3 years after the Brexit vote did the Conservatives win all those seats in the so-called Red Wall? I don't like that phrase. It assumes that people always vote one way. No party owns a part of the country. But there are similar things going on. Not exact. It's analogous in some ways, which is the politics of who I am, my national identity, my sense of patriotism is more important than anything else. Which is why I come back to the challenge for Keir Starmer's Labour Party is how does it take 5% of those voters from the SNP? Because, and if this is the last question, I'll just say that there are broadly speaking three routes to a majority Labour government. The first is Labour just continues to remarkably outperform its generational trend in England, which is where it is right now. The Labour Party could probably win a British majority in England alone right now. Just the numbers are so stark in terms of the opinion polls. And in Wales, and that gives you some comfort. So that's the first route. Probably unlikely, but possibly unlikely. The second route is a recovery in Scotland for the Labour Party. Gain between 6 and 15 seats, which may be enough to get Labour an absolute majority. And the third route is a Lib Dem recovery in the southwest of England and those lovely Yorkshire market towns with hanging baskets that don't vote Labour but are willing to vote Lib Dem. And those are the three routes that Labour has to a majority government. And all three are in play. And I think for the Conservatives, there's probably only one route in play. And for the Lib Dem recovery, a moderate Labour Party, and this is another conversation, a moderate Labour Party in general is good for them. A moderate Labour Party is good for the Lib Dems. I know some people say, well, if you've got a moderate Labour Party and a moderate Lib Dems, you're both in the middle. And that gives the centre-right a space all to its own because you divide the vote. The public are smart enough now these days to know that who is the challenger to the incumbent. They can work it out. You don't need to tell them to vote tactically. They do it anyway. And also, in the southwest of England, why did the Lib Dems lose all those... this is my last meander. Why did the Lib Dems lose all those seats in 2019 in the southwest of England? I know lots of people say it was Brexit, and that would be part of it, but it was Jeremy Corbyn. And so, Jim, what are you talking about? How can the Lib Dems lose seats to the Conservatives in the southwest of England because of Jeremy Corbyn? simply because a sufficient number of people were understandably terrified of a Corbyn premiership that they weren't willing to vote Lib Dem because it would risk a Labour government. Now, there are many things you can say about Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, one a former Director of Public Prosecutions and one a former economist at the Bank of England. One thing you can't say is they terrify Lib Dem voters in the southwest of England. So I think a moderate Labour Party gives Labour 3 routes to a majority, let alone being biggest party. So to be partisan for 1 second, I think for the first time since 2005, in 2024, or very early in 2025, Labour has a remarkable chance of winning an election against Liz Truss's successor.
Well, on that interesting note, I personally am not sure they can change yet again. It seems that would raise real problems of credibility doing that. In any case, Jim, thanks very much indeed for a fascinating talk, and I'm sure everybody very much enjoyed it. We could go on for a long time, but thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.